Ethan Carter had learned to measure time differently. He no longer counted weekends, holidays, or birthdays. Instead, he counted school mornings he never missed, lunchboxes he packed before sunrise, and bedtime stories he read no matter how exhausted he felt. Ever since his wife passed away after a long illness, his world had become centered around one person, his 7-year-old daughter, Lily. By day, Ethan worked as a warehouse supervisor, often staying late to earn extra overtime. The pay wasn't remarkable, but it kept a roof over their heads and food on the table. Life was simple, sometimes difficult, yet he refused to let Lily grow up feeling deprived. She had already lost enough. Their small apartment held very few valuable possessions. The oldest was a weathered upright piano standing beside the living room window. Several keys were chipped, and the wood had faded with age, but Ethan took care of it as if it were priceless. Every evening after dinner, while Lily colored or finished her homework nearby, he would sit quietly at the piano and play the same gentle melody. One evening, Lily looked up from her drawing. "Dad, why don't you ever play a different song?" Ethan smiled softly without stopping. "Because some promises deserve to be kept." She didn't fully understand, but she nodded anyway. The melody hadn't been written by Ethan. It belonged to his closest friend, Daniel, a gifted musician who had composed it years earlier for the woman he loved. Before Daniel found the courage to give her the song, a tragic accident took his life. Among the few things he left behind was a handwritten sheet of music and a promise Ethan had never forgotten. A week before Christmas, Lily surprised her father by entering his name in a local holiday charity concert after hearing the organizers searching for a pianist. "You always make me smile when you play," she said. "Maybe your music can make someone else smile too." Unable to refuse her hopeful eyes, Ethan agreed. As he sat before the grand piano on the night of the concert, he had no idea that the melody he was about to play would bring someone face to face with a love she had believed was lost forever. The first note barely lingered in the air before conversations around the ballroom began to fade. Guests who had been chatting over coffee and desserts slowly turned toward the stage. Ethan wasn't trying to impress anyone. He played with his eyes lowered, letting his fingers follow the familiar path they had traveled hundreds of times before. Every note carried quiet emotion instead of showmanship. Near the entrance, Victoria Hayes had just arrived after finishing a board meeting that had run longer than expected. As CEO of one of the city's fastest-growing technology companies, her schedule rarely left room for events like this, but the charity's founder was an old family friend, so she had promised to attend. She handed her coat to an attendant and took only a few steps into the hall before the melody reached her. Her footsteps stopped instantly. The smile she had been wearing disappeared. For a long moment, she simply stood there, unable to move. "No," she whispered under her breath. Her eyes searched the stage. A man she had never seen before sat at the piano, completely absorbed in the music. Yet the melody was unmistakable. 20 years vanished in an instant. She was back in college, sitting beneath an old oak tree while Daniel unfolded a notebook filled with handwritten music. "I wrote this for someone special," he had said with a shy smile. "For who?" Daniel had laughed nervously. "I'll tell her when I'm brave enough." He had played only part of the melody that afternoon, promising she would hear the rest when the time was right. But that day never came. After graduation, life had taken them in different directions. Before they could meet again, Victoria learned that Daniel had died in a tragic accident. The unfinished melody became one of the memories she locked deep inside her heart. Now every missing note was being played exactly as Daniel had once described it. Victoria felt tears gather before she realized she was crying. She slowly walked closer to the stage, unable to take her eyes off the pianist. When the final chord faded into silence, the audience erupted into applause. Victoria remained motionless. There was only one question echoing in her mind. How could a complete stranger know the song that Daniel had never played for anyone else? The applause echoed through the ballroom, but Ethan barely noticed it. He gave a polite nod, stood from the piano, and reached for the worn leather folder that held the sheet music. Performing had never been about recognition. He simply wanted to honor a promise he had carried for nearly 2 decades. As he stepped away from the stage, a woman approached him with hurried but hesitant steps. She was dressed in a tailored navy suit, her posture confident, yet her eyes told a different story. They were red from tears she hadn't expected to shed. "Excuse me," she said softly. "May I ask you something?" Ethan stopped and nodded. "Of course." She looked at the music folder in his hands before meeting his eyes. "The song you just played? Where did you learn it?" There was something in her voice that made Ethan pause. "My friend wrote it," he replied. "His name was Daniel." The color drained from the woman's face. For a moment she couldn't speak. Finally she whispered, "Daniel Harper?" Ethan stared at her in surprise. "You knew him?" A faint smile mixed with tears appeared on her face. "I knew him better than most people did." Silence settled between them. Ethan carefully opened the old folder and removed a yellowed sheet of handwritten music. The corners were worn, and the ink had faded with time, but Daniel's neat handwriting was still recognizable. "I've carried this with me ever since he passed away," Ethan said quietly. "We were best friends." Victoria's hands trembled as she looked at the page. "I recognize his handwriting." Ethan took a slow breath. "A few weeks before the accident, Daniel told me he'd written this melody for someone he loved. He was nervous about giving it to her, but he said she deserved to hear it when the moment was right." Victoria lowered her eyes, unable to stop the tears. "He never got the chance," she whispered. Ethan nodded sadly. "No. After we lost him, I couldn't bring myself to throw the music away, so I made a promise that his song would never disappear." Victoria closed her eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by memories she had spent years trying to bury. Hearing the complete melody and learning that someone had faithfully protected Daniel's final gift all these years felt like finding a forgotten piece of her own heart. For several moments, neither Ethan nor Victoria spoke. The noise of the ballroom faded into the background as if the rest of the world had disappeared. Victoria gently traced the edge of the old sheet music, careful not to damage the fragile paper. "I spent years wondering if Daniel had forgotten me," she said quietly. "When I heard about the accident, there were so many unanswered questions. I never knew he had written something for me." Ethan smiled sadly. "He never forgot you. In fact, he talked about you more than anyone else. He just kept waiting for the perfect moment, and life never gave him that chance." Victoria lowered her head, letting the tears fall freely. Success had brought her wealth, respect, and influence, but none of it had filled the empty place Daniel had left behind. Hearing his melody after so many years reminded her that some feelings never truly disappear, they simply become quiet. A small voice interrupted the silence. "Dad?" Lily walked over, holding her father's coat. She looked curiously at Victoria before smiling politely. "I liked your piano," she said to Ethan. "You didn't miss a single note." Ethan laughed softly and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "That's because you were cheering for me." Victoria watched the exchange with warm eyes. It wasn't the polished performance that had moved her most. It was seeing a father who carried grief without letting it harden his heart, choosing instead to raise his daughter with patience, kindness, and hope. She turned back to Ethan. "Thank you for keeping Daniel's promise alive all these years." "I only did what I believed a friend should do," he replied. Victoria carefully folded the copy of the sheet music Ethan had given her. "I'll treasure this for the rest of my life." As Ethan and Lily walked toward the exit, hand in hand, Victoria remained standing beside the piano. For the first time in many years, the memory of her first love no longer brought only pain. It also brought gratitude. Some people leave this world too soon, but the love they give doesn't end with them. Sometimes it survives in a melody, a promise faithfully kept, and in the quiet courage of ordinary people who refuse to let beautiful memories fade away.